Good morning. So, Ireland, a non-nuclear country, as Christoph said, a small island off the coast of Europe with one land border with Northern Ireland, part of the UK. No nuclear facilities. The nearest nuclear facility is 110 kilometres away from the Irish coast. So, really, did we need a national emergency plan for nuclear accidents? And that's, for many years, what was thought in Ireland. We didn't actually need one. Then Chernobyl happened. And suddenly we were inundated with requests for information, concerns about radiation levels, and particularly because Ireland has a big sector on agriculture and food exports. There were a lot of questions. There were hundreds of companies who suddenly required monitoring certificates for their exports going outside the EU, and that still continues today. Even today, each year we issue about 3,000 certificates for companies that are exporting foods and pharmaceutical products outside of the EU. So we looked around at that time, it was before my time, and saw, well, there's many facilities closer than Chernobyl is. And while unlikely, what if there was a large-scale accident that affected Ireland? We really have to have a plan. So it really became clear in 1986 that we needed a nuclear emergency plan. So just to give you a little information in terms of how emergency planning works in Ireland, it's based on the systems approach to planning, which is used at a national level, a regional level, and a local level in terms of at county level. And it involves a continuous cycle of activity. So the principal elements of the approach are, first of all, the hazard analysis, to identify what are the risks, what are the impacts we might have to deal with. And this also allows us to compare the different scenarios, so nuclear scenarios versus weather, versus tsunami, versus flu pandemic, and so on, to put them in context, to look at the all-hazard approach, to see where the similar consequences might arise, so that we can learn from each other. We're a small country, fewer than 5 million people, and as a result, we have to pool resources. We can't work independently on nuclear emergencies and not talk to the people who are also working on flu pandemic and so on. Then also mitigation. Now, for radiological emergencies, obviously we have controls. We are the licensing authority in the Environmental Protection Agency, so there are controls in place in terms of anybody who wants to get a license to use radiation sources. For nuclear, because we don't operate any nuclear facilities within Ireland, they're more limited, but we do see that our role in terms of being part of the global nuclear safety regime and being a voice there in terms of transparency on nuclear safety issues, and pushing for nuclear safety standards to be set and met, that's part of the mitigation. Planning and preparedness, obviously all based on the hazard analysis. So what are we trying to plan for, what do we need to put in place, and how can we manage to do that? A coordinated response, again, small agencies typically in Ireland, so we have to coordinate with all of our government departments and agencies, so we're all working together for the same aim. And then recovery. And recovery includes not just recovery from any contamination and so on, but also review and feedback. So to feed back into the loop, into the hazard analysis, into the planning and preparedness. And this is done after any event, not just a nuclear event, but say after the dioxin crisis in Ireland, where pork products were found to be contaminated with dioxins from a particular supplier. We used those lessons there about communication, about contamination of food, and we fed them back into our National Emergency Plan for nuclear accidents as well. We also used exercises as a way of feeding back information and findings to improve our plans continuously. So our hazard identification and risk analysis at the first level, it's about looking at the different type of scenarios that occur, and then looking in more depth in terms of what actually that they could lead to. So in our analysis, we've looked at things from a source in Ireland, a nuclear accident abroad, satellite re-entry, nuclear-powered vessel having an accident close to the coast of Ireland. We've performed a number of key hazard assessments over the last number of years, focusing on the nuclear sites that are closest to us and also our own sources within Ireland. The nuclear ones have all been published on our website. So we looked at Sellafield, nuclear power plants in the UK, and also the planned nuclear power plants in the UK. I'm just going to show you our approach to doing this for the nuclear power plants in the UK. So we have in place in terms of preparedness, but also for response, computer prediction models in terms of atmospheric dispersion and food chain modelling. So we used 21 years worth of weather data and average sea currents, because we also looked at if there was a release of radioactivity to the Irish Sea. We calculated the resulting environmental levels in Ireland based on these weather data, and based on that, the radiation dose to Ireland, so we could prioritise what's the best way of reducing people's doses. So we looked at 8 sites in the UK. We ran the model for 48-hour release, restarting every 3 hours for each site. And based on that, we identified the worst-case weather scenario for impacting Ireland in terms of both short-term doses, but also longer-term in terms of food contamination. So this meant over 1 million runs of our model. So it was quite an intensive process that we went through, but we felt it was important to have real data in terms of what could happen. So we looked at doses just after the end of the plume passage, 1 week on, and 1 year on. And these were all severe nuclear accident scenarios, and very clearly, as was expected, most of the time it really was about, not about short-term doses. It wasn't about inhalation and ground shine or cloud shine. But in one of the very severe accidents that we looked at, combined with the worst weather scenario, it did exceed what currently our level, our trigger for staying indoors of 10 millisieverts. Now we are currently reviewing that particular reference level, but at the time it certainly sort of fed into our thinking in terms of emergency planning. But it confirmed what we had always said, was that there would be no need for any evacuations in Ireland for a nuclear accident, because that's what their perception was, that they would have to evacuate. So we looked at 1 year on, and it was very clear again that ingestion was the main pathway. So for that worst scenario, if people continued to eat the foods, and there are certain people who would eat a high proportion of locally sourced foods, particularly farmers and so on. And while Dublin is on the east coast, there are actually a number of large farmers around the Dublin area. And in this particular scenario we looked at, it was Dublin that had the highest levels of contamination. So they would have gotten, over the first year, assuming they kept eating their normal food and so on, about up to 300 millisieverts if no actions were taken. So that's a very serious dose, obviously. I mean, it's got very conservative assumptions behind it, but it was important to really to show the priority in terms of where we should be putting our resources, limited as they are, in terms of planning for emergencies. And even for the other scenarios, in those other scenarios, no public protective actions will be required except for food controls and agricultural measures be put in place quickly. We looked at the radionuclides. Again, so in terms of our monitoring that we do, our modelling that we do, we could identify which were the most important ones to develop our expertise in. And it was, as expected, iodine and cesium. So we looked at a whole range of different foodstuffs that are grown in Ireland, and we used Irish parameters, because we had customised the food and dose model of August previously. So we had actual Irish data in terms of seasonalities, in terms of how much grass cows eat and so on. All of that information was available. We looked at the different times of year, what the impact was of different times of year on the actual concentrations you would get in food. We compared all the foods with the European maximum permitted levels for food, and found that for severe accident scenarios, if the wind was coming towards us from the accident site, you would generally need some level of food controls and agricultural protective actions, which just really cemented the idea this is a very important area for Ireland to be prepared for. We also looked at the question that we always get asked by the agricultural experts: how long are we going to have to put in place these protective actions? So we got information on that for them in terms of severity of accident, weather, and the time of year. It varied for those. So as a result, we were able to tell them for different seasons and so on what might be expected. So from all the scenarios we looked at, really the message was ingestion. If we can protect people against exposure through ingestion, then we're going to significantly reduce any dose they might get. Ireland is not just about the technical. It's not just about the numbers, as we heard, and it was very obviously, most importantly, is the radiation protection in the event of a nuclear accident. But in fact, Ireland has a particular reputation in terms of food, and we have some very important visitors who like to come and see our food export areas, and Ireland is known for having sort of green food and important international exports, I should say, that have to be protected as well, because socially and economically, if there was contamination of the environment in Ireland, the impacts would be huge. So that led us to say, well, okay, we've now looked at the radiological impact, we've looked at the food impacts and so on. What about losses to the economy? What about the social changes that would happen in the event of an emergency? So we commissioned the Economic and Social Research Institute in Ireland to undertake a study of what the cost to the economy would be. They looked, we kind of took to where the main costs would be, just to make the study reasonably quick and reasonably inexpensive. They looked at agriculture, so losses of agriculture, both through foods that may exceed the maximum permitted levels, but also due to reputational damages, particularly for exports. Tourism, so again, lots of people coming to Ireland. Tourism is a big part of our economy as well. Business in terms of lost days, monitoring costs, additional monitoring costs, and looked at 4 scenarios, starting off with where there was a severe nuclear accident somewhere in northwest Europe that resulted in protective actions having to be taken in the country. So there was a lot of media attention and so on. As it happened, the wind was blowing in the other direction. It was coming from the west. So Ireland actually was not contaminated. But obviously there were reputational costs for the first year, particularly for, we have a lot of exports outside of the EU, so trying to re-establish those exports and having to do additional monitoring to prove that our food was not actually contaminated by the accident. And even in that and then up to the most severe accident scenario I've already shown you, when you have a number of years in which the food some foods may exceed the maximum permitted levels. The 4 billion per 4 billion was the losses for the one where there was no contamination of Ireland. It was just a loss based on loss of reputation for our exports and for tourism. And 160 billion for where there actually was contamination into the longer term. So a summary of the hazard assessments was that most significant route was consumption of contaminated food. We could avert most of that by having the right protective actions and by working with the Food Safety Authority and the Department of Agriculture. But also the importance of agriculture and food to Ireland's economy. Just to put some numbers on it, 15% of the world's infant formula is made in Ireland. It's a very sensitive market. If there was any perception of contamination of milk in Ireland, that's gone. And Ireland is the 5th largest exporter of beef in the world. So again, our experience post-Chernobyl and post-Fukushima, where there suddenly was a big increase in people looking for certification of certain products to South America, for example, after Fukushima, even though the contamination levels were barely detectable in Ireland. Just going back then to, that's the first step in terms of hazard analysis. So in terms of planning and preparedness, we have a lead government system, so whichever government department is normally responsible for an area are also responsible for leading the coordination of the response in an emergency. And we have a government task force in emergency planning where all the people who have senior people with responsibility for emergency planning in all the government departments and agencies meet to discuss joint protocols, to share experience of events, share experience of exercises, to organise joint exercises. And that meets about every 6 to 8 weeks, and it's a very useful forum. And one of the actual side effects of it is that you get to know all the emergency planners in all of the other areas. Then we have a linkage between the national plans, which would be run from, the response would be run from the National Emergency Coordination Centre, and also the local level coordination centres and regional level coordination centres as well. So there are direct links there that are, and because they're used for all hazards, all emergencies, they do get exercised all the time, particularly in the winter time, where there's usually some sort of flooding or winter event that has to be managed from that centre. We have a national framework for emergencies, so the idea is that any national emergency would be operated in much the same way in terms of coordination of public communication, coordination of information coming in and out, there's a common information management system that's used for everything. So rather than having to reinvent the wheel, we can learn from each other, and it means they get tested very often in actual anger. So in terms of for the nuclear group, obviously the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food Safety Authority and Meteorological Service, Department of Agriculture. There's a range of agencies. These are just the main ones. There's many more that will be brought in as needed. And again, as we discovered after Fukushima, we hadn't considered non-food imports. That hadn't been considered. But because of the government task force, we were very quickly able to get access to experts from the government department responsible and the National Consumer Agency who would deal with non-food issues as well. So it meant that even though they weren't part of the plan, quite quickly we were able to bring them in because we right away knew who to contact. The emergency coordination group in an actual emergency, they will be pulling in information from the EPA technical assessment team, from the agricultural experts, the food experts, and all of that all together around the decision table, and we are part of that decision making. So the experts are actually on the coordination group as well, providing a link to the other experts working back at base. And also, public information is coordinated by a subgroup of that group to make sure that we all have the same message going out. So every organisation who's identified as potentially having a role in an emergency has a list of what their roles are. So for example, summarising the EPA's roles are that we have the 24/7 duty officer who assesses notifications and alerts. We provide radiological briefings to departments and agencies both in preparedness and in response, because we recognise that other departments and agencies don't have radiation experts. Modelling and measurement of radioactivity in the environment to food and feed, food and pharmaceutical imports and exports testing, information to media and public coordinated through the centre, and then advice to Irish citizens abroad through the Department of Foreign Affairs and the relevant embassies. Our risk assessments also influence in terms of the monitoring we do. So we have a national monitoring network, which is more focused on the East Coast because of the proximity to nuclear power plants in the UK, but is across the country. The data from the gamma dose rate monitoring goes directly to our website so the public can access that. That's been in place since 2005. And I'd say until 2011, probably about 20 members of the public had ever looked at it. And then when Fukushima happened, suddenly there was more interest. People didn't realise it was there. They had no need to look for it. And actually, we found it generated some trust. So people came, independently wrote to us and said, we see that you have access to this data. We were able to look back on old data, and we could see that there had been no increase as a result of Fukushima. And that's a great thing. Other government departments should be doing something similar. So that was nice to know, because we were wondering, if nobody's looking at this for the last 7 years, do we still need to continue doing this work? Because it's a bit of effort to make sure the data streams are still working all the time. But for that reason alone, for building that trust, we feel it was worthwhile keeping on. Having mentioned food many times, the EUUS Handbook was something that was very important to us. We had some outline plans in place in Ireland, but we really wanted to look more in depth, and we had found that based on a number of emergency exercises we'd held at a national level in 2005 and 2007, that really the expertise that had been built up in the agricultural community from Chernobyl had disappeared. People had retired, they'd moved on, and it didn't exist anymore. So we needed to get that back. So the way of doing that was to set up a multidisciplinary group to customise the EUUS Handbook for management of contaminated food production systems in Europe for the Irish conditions. And we'd already customised the modelling, the food chain modelling, so this was another step along that chain. So at this point we brought in experts from different sectors in agriculture, sea fishery, veterinary, food safety, environmental protection, as well as the radiation protection experts, and started work on that. And through a series of exercises, workshops, discussions, pulling our hair out and so on, we eventually got to a list for each sector, for each season of the year, a list of what potential protective actions could be put in place that were technically feasible in Ireland, and that we knew how effective they were based on studies that had been done elsewhere. But that was only the first step, because then we had to say, well, okay, they're technically feasible, but are they socially acceptable to people? Are they acceptable to the communities who are going to have to put them in place, or are going to have to put trust in them? So then, as part of the Prepare project, we set up a stakeholder panel That included the people the representatives from the different agricultural sectors, the radiation protection people, the Food Safety Authority, but also the meat industry, a representative from the meat industry group, the dairy industry group, the National Consumer Agency, the grain and feed industry group, the main Irish Farmers Union, and two of the largest retail organisations in Ireland for supermarkets as well, to get their views on that. There were many fruitful discussions, but some of the key outcome from the panel, besides looking at the detail in terms of different actions and which were acceptable, which were not, the most important thing coming out was communications. Communication with farmers, with food processors, suppliers, retailers, consumers. And just note, we knew that they had to have information, but really it was about the communication between those industries. So the suppliers were going to be getting questions from the processors and vice versa. And really the message was, they couldn't wait to hear it on the media. At that point, it was too late. They needed to have sort of direct access to get some information as it was going to the media. They could, you know, if they were behind the curve when they were getting asked a question by somebody who imports their products or uses their products in food production, and they didn't have the answers, the trust would be lost at that point. So they need to be part of our communications plan. Talking about communications then, obviously the public are a key group. Not as easy to kind of engage with when you don't have a facility. There's no sort of ready-made group that you can engage with in preparedness. But what we have done is that every few years we run surveys of 1,000 people, members of the public, to get views on radiation issues. And then we'd also hold focus groups as well to kind of delve more into particular issues at different times. So just from the last one that was run, where one of the questions was, which of the statements people agree with in terms of what effect a nuclear accident in the UK would have on their health, from catastrophic to no impact or don't know. And very clearly, most of the people believed that there would be at least some impact, if not very significant impact, on their health from a nuclear accident in the UK. So there's no point in us starting our messaging from, we're talking about food. We have to go through the fact that people had this idea that if they go outdoors, they're in danger, or if their children are playing outdoors, they may be exposing them to dangerous levels of radiation. We have to start from there. We have to meet them where they are. And we also had another question, I don't have statistics here, but it was about who they want to hear their information from. And number one, who do they trust, was medical professionals. So that told us straight away that our chief medical officer has to be front and centre in terms of giving information supported by the radiation protection experts, not the other way around. So that was a change we made to our plan. We also asked them, what information do you want about emergency planning? Most people said, none. All we want to know is there is a plan and where do I find the information. They don't want to know the details until something actually happens, because there's so many different emergency plans for different type of events, and it's too much for people to take on board. All they want to know is that somebody's taking care of it, and they go to this website. So now in Ireland we have an emergency planning website where you can get access to all the emergency plans if you need them, and a booklet was sent to every household and was available in different languages for the main immigrant groups in Ireland, an easy-to-read version for people with learning difficulties, and also a Braille version for people who can't see as well. So just to give them the basic information and to tell them where more information was available. We also asked, in the event of a nuclear accident in the UK, what would you do to find out what their instinct was? We were afraid it was, we're getting the car and heading to the west of Ireland. But actually, no, most people said they would actually follow government guidelines or wait and get more information. So that was good, because there had been some voices saying, well, people will just sort of try and escape from this, because based on everything they've seen on TV and in movies for the last 30 years, that's what you should do. But so it was reassuring to know that that wasn't the first instinct, and that they would be looking for information, but it means we have to have that information readily very quickly. Otherwise, they may decide to do the wrong thing. So communication in an emergency, we have, as I said, a subgroup of the National Emergency Coordination Group, and they are the press officers from all of the government departments and agencies who are responding. So they are coordinating what information is going out, when it's going out, and so on. And this was used in a good way during the Fukushima accident. 2 or 3 days after we first measured the iodine on our air filters, we started to measure radioactive iodine in milk samples. And we wanted to give that information out to the public. And so the Food Safety Authority and what was then the Radiological Protection Institute of Ireland both developed messages based on the same numbers. They did it from how many litres of milk you would have to drink to reach your radiation dose limit. We did it in terms of what the fraction of the dose limit was, so it was the same message but from different perspectives, just reinforcing each other. And the two press officers were on the phone saying, send. So it came out at exactly the same time. There was no perception in the media that there were different stories and so on. And it worked quite well. So the hope is that in an emergency, the same thing would happen. We would use media, radio, TV, websites. There's a central website, which has a dark side, so that can be sort of activated quickly and take a large number of users at any one time, as well as having links to all the other main organisations who'll have more detail. Twitter, we've looked at, well, we have to expand into social media. We don't have the resources to do all the social media channels, so we figure we have to really look at Twitter in particular. Press conferences as a way, we have a small number of people, we can't do multiple interviews, so a combination of press conferences and having a recording of the key messages that can be used on local radio to get the message out, and then also directly to the key business groups, particularly agriculture and food. And one thing as well that we came out in terms of talking to the public was that the second group that they actually trusted after medical personnel were scientists. After that, it was politicians way down the line and so on. So scientists, there's a group of scientists that people see every day. They have great trust in them in Ireland, and we felt, well, they could be used. They already have a sort of relationship with the public, and that's the weather forecasters. So as part of our plan, the weather forecasters will be involved in getting the message out, particularly in the shorter term, in terms of plume and so on, and what people should be doing and where they can get more information, because they are a very trusted group in Ireland, and everybody stops to watch the weather. It's the most important topic in Ireland. So finally, in terms of further work, we're currently finalising a major revision to a national emergency plan for nuclear accidents. We're maintaining the stakeholder group, and we're also making sure that the national framework has been redeveloped and relaunched this year, making sure that our plans fit in with that as well, including a new public communications plan, which has been expanded, as I said, to include social media, and also making sure that the links with the local level, the police, the fire service, the ambulance and so on are there. That's more for the radiological emergency side, but it's important for nuclear as well, because they can feed back information in terms of what people are doing and asking about at the local level. So we're revising the plan based on, we had an IRS review mission from the IEA a couple of years ago, so the findings from that, the BSS directive, those in the EU know exactly what that means, the IEA's new standard, GSR Part 7, and then also information from the risk assessments, learnings from response to nuclear and radiological and non-nuclear events, and also the stakeholder panel. And that's all being finalised at the moment, hoping it'll be finished later this year. So finally, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Veronica Smith and Robert Ryan in the EPA, and also Keith Leonard of the National Directorate for Fire and Emergency Management. And to thank you for your attention, and the organisers for inviting me to give this presentation. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.